Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, host of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational leaders and founders.
I am Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and much more. Before we formally introduce you, Dr. Ellie, we always like to mention past episodes of our podcast to check out. On the Coping Podcast, I featured my colleague Ben Kessler in a fascinating episode we appropriately called Technology, Addiction, and Kids and Teens Help. I also featured Dr. Michelle Cutler, where she answered questions about the July 4th mass shooting that occurred here in Highland Park. This episode is brought to you by Coping Partners. Coping Partners is a mental health practice in the Chicago suburbs dedicated to helping children, adolescents, and adults. We help manage various challenges, including anxiety, divorce, behavioral issues, relationship issues, and much more. Check out more episodes of our podcast and our website at copingpartners.com, and you can contact us with any questions you have.
Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice.
We are very excited to introduce Dr. Eli Lebowitz. He studies and treats childhood and adolescent anxiety at the Yale Child Study Center. He developed a methodology called SPACE, and SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions.
Unlike many of the traditional treatments for childhood anxiety, SPACE is a parent-based treatment program that helps parents change their behaviors in the service of treating their children's anxiety. So it's what I typically call in my practice the behind-the-scenes way of treating a childhood problem, and it's really through the parents alone.
And some of the anxiety problems that are treated with SPACE include separation anxiety, social and generalized anxiety, fears and phobias, panic disorder, or OCD, and many, many more. And
Dr. Lebowitz is the author of the book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, which I have here. And it is a wonderful, informative book. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Those are some tough acts to follow in terms of the previous guests that you've had. So I'm honored to be on. Thanks so much.
You got it. This is awesome. So I just wanted to start first with, we'll talk about some specific examples for parents who are listening. We're going to go into really specific examples. But I want to start with, how did you get into this area of research and treatment to begin with?
Yeah, this story goes back quite a few years at this point. When I finished my dissertation, I did a PhD in psychology and trained in psychoanalysis, which was the thing of the day, and a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy that was just kind of getting started. And I was working in a large children's hospital, and I was actually working in two clinics. One of them was an anxiety and OCD clinic where the treatment that was delivered was cognitive behavioral therapy. And I also worked in a parent guidance clinic for parents of youth with really severe behavior problems, delinquency, aggression, vandalism, things like that. And one of my jobs in the anxiety OCD program was to try to screen incoming new families and try to figure out, would these be a fit for treatment? So what did I do? I had a very easy method. It wasn't very complicated. I would mostly just ask, does your kid want help? Do they want to do this treatment? And when parents said, yeah, or the kid said, yeah, absolutely, I want to do this, we'd say, like, great, you're a good fit for this treatment. And when parents said, well, they don't really want to do it, or the kid wasn't really very motivated, I'd say, well, you're not a really good fit for this treatment, and I don't think we're going to be able to help you. But I got really frustrated over time Parents would say to me, and it's so reasonable, they would say to me, yeah, my kid is too anxious to do the kind of treatment that you're talking about. Cognitive behavioral therapy, that's a really demanding treatment. It requires a lot of motivation. It means doing exposures to the things that you're afraid of. And the parents would say, well, of course they're anxious. That's why we're here. So do you not treat anxious kids with your anxiety treatment? Like, what is going on? It didn't make sense to them. And I have to admit, it didn't make a lot of sense to me either, because on the same day that I was saying to those parents, oh, sorry, I don't think we're going to be able to help you, I would walk down the hall to the parent guidance clinic and say to the parents of a kid with, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, oh, we don't need your kid to come in. We're going to work with you, because that's, for a long time, that's been the go-to approach in the externalizing problem world, in the behavior problem world, is like, we're going to work with parents. These kids are often not, ideal candidates for therapy. They'd rather be setting fire to the police station. And so we would work with the parents and say, hey, we're going to give you the tools. And it just really drove me to think a lot about, why do we not have more to offer to parents of kids with anxiety? Like, why is there so little to offer there? Because when researchers tried to work with parents in the past in the treatment of child anxiety, they all did the same thing, basically, almost everybody. And that was try to train the parent to do cognitive behavioral therapy to their child. And it turns out that that is not the best approach, because if your kid doesn't really want to do CBT with their therapist, they are definitely not going to do it with mom.
I was going to say, they definitely are not going to want to do it with their parents. We know that.
Exactly. I mean, who can get your kid to do anything better, you or somebody, literally anybody else on the planet, usually, right? And so it turned out that wasn't really the best approach. And so I really got to thinking a lot about, like, what can we do with parents? And that was, like, part of what really led to this development.
That makes a lot of sense. I really like how you conceptualize anxiety in children as not just a child problem, but you're also very careful not to blame parents. And I agree. Can you share more about how you understand this system between the parents and the kids?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really important point, because what we're really trying to do is change the way that we think about child anxiety disorders. For the longest time, the way we thought about child anxiety disorders is basically adult anxiety disorders in a smaller package, right? In a smaller person, in a younger person, as though it's exactly the same phenomenon. And that works to a degree, because, in fact, child anxiety in many ways is very similar to adult anxiety. You do have worries, you have fears, you have avoidance, all of those things that you have in adults. But what that really misses is that actually child anxiety is not quite the same as adult anxiety. And the reason it isn't is deeply rooted in our biology, in our basic makeup as, like, our species, right? This isn't like just a, abstract idea. It's deeply rooted in our biology, especially, and in particular, in our biology as mammals. Because pretty much all mammals are born very ill prepared for life, right? Like, we're not able to survive as mammals without somebody else. Of course, we're not able to feed ourselves, so we'd all die off if nobody fed us, but we're also not able to protect ourselves. Why is that important? Because we have been shaped to respond differently to fear when we're young, when we know, I'm putting in quotes because this is like evolution, but we basically know, look, I can't deal with these threats on my own, right? Mm-hmm. If you imagine a grown-up who is facing a threat, let's say somebody is, like, I don't know, yelling at them on the street, what do? They do the classic fight or flight, right? Maybe they confront that person, maybe they avoid them. Well, if you walk up to somebody's baby and you scare that baby, which, to be clear, I'm not encouraging you to do, I don't actually recommend that. All of my preliminary pilot research indicates that it will not make you many friends if you start walking up to people's babies and scaring them. But if you did, that baby is not going to do fight. It's not going to do flight. What is the baby going to do? It's going to cry, right? We all know it's going to cry because that is a way of alerting somebody else, meaning that in children, we respond differently to fear. So if you have an anxiety disorder, meaning you have chronic fear activation in the wrong context, what are you going to do? You're going to chronically activate somebody else. You're going to activate your parent. You're going to look to them to protect you, to soothe you, to comfort you, to reassure you, to defend you, right? It's all directed toward the parent. And in that sense, child anxiety disorders really are interpersonal phenomena. They're not individual phenomena. It's not like having, a sprained ankle that lives just in your foot or a dental cavity that lives in your mouth. It is something that exists between parent and child.
That attachment system.
Exactly. That's how our species evolved to deal with fear. That's actually the part of child anxiety that most differentiates it from adult anxiety, but it really changes how we think of these problems and how we work with parents when we realize just how interpersonal of an issue it actually is.
I'd love to talk, Dr. Ellie, about a couple examples. And you mentioned anxiety and social anxiety. I was actually talking to a friend. I had a gathering a couple weeks ago, and he just said it's really tough for me to be here because I have social anxiety, and he's had it since he was a kid. And I'm glad he felt, comfortable sharing that with me and that he got out of a comfort zone. But I'd love to hear some examples from you, and you have one where how it affected siblings.
Yeah.
You could talk about that.
Yeah, and by the way, the example of your friend is such a classic example because these problems, anxiety problems, they do start in childhood, right? Like that is so typical. You could meet somebody, maybe they're first diagnosed with anxiety. They might be 55 years old, they might be 65 years old, 45 years old, but you ask them, when did this problem start? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, it's been my whole life, right? Maybe I didn't get help. I never got treatment. Nobody knew about it. But when did it start? It started when I was a child because like these problems start when you're really small. So in that sense, it's really typical. And yeah, the the social anxiety will often, like all the anxiety problems will affect the parents and the family because of that tendency to look to parents and because of parents' natural tendency to accommodate those anxiety problems, meaning to just change what they are doing because of what their anxious child is experiencing, because I don't want them to be anxious. And in social anxiety, a lot of times we'll see a really big impact on siblings as well. For example, I worked with a family where there was one child who had pretty severe social anxiety, so felt really overwhelmed in social situations. Now, I'm not just talking about the kid who doesn't want to get up in front of everybody and start belting out songs out loud, right? Like that's what we call normal. But I'm talking about a child who, just like walking down a hall is flooded with thoughts about what's that person thinking about me? Am I walking funny? Do they think I'm stupid? Won't go to any event. Now, where do the siblings come in? Well,
they have all these these thoughts inside that are holding them down, essentially.
Yes, exactly. There's that constant voice, right? That's telling you you're messing up, you're saying the wrong thing, you're not funny, you look like a fool, you're going to make a mistake. Like that voice is just chronically going, and it makes you avoid. You might be really lonely. You might wish, oh my gosh, I wish I had some friends that I could just like hang out with and have fun. But you'll also avoid any situation that might lead to making those friends because, oh no, it's going to go so badly. Where do the siblings come in? This kid had 2 siblings, one older, one younger, right? The child that was the patient was 11 years old, had an older sibling who was a teenager and a younger sibling. Those children were growing up as though they had social anxiety. They were not allowed to have any play dates, for example, in their house. And the parent would explain to them, like, it makes your sibling, right? It makes the other, it makes them so uncomfortable if somebody comes to the house. So maybe you go to your friend's house. Now, if you have kids, like you might have experienced this, if one kid always wants to be the guest and never the host, at some point they start to get some pushback on that.
Sure.
Because the friends don't get it, right? Like, what's your problem? Why don't you want us to come to your house? Sometimes that creates some friction. They had actually lost friends because that friend was like, you know what? I don't think like you really like me, or you're taking advantage of me, or something's wrong. The parents start to wonder what is going on in that household that they never want our child to see, right? Now, like nothing's going on except there's a kid with a lot of social anxiety, but you start to wonder about it. And so,
but that accommodation has now trickled down and affected the quote unquote healthy siblings too.
Exactly. And if there was an event, maybe there's a concert or a play or a movie, even if the sibling with if the child with anxiety wasn't comfortable going, well, a lot of times the siblings would have to miss it too.
Ugh.
Right. And so, but okay, like we understand because the kid has anxiety. And so, we're trying to do our best by him. And this is like a really important thing about accommodation. Accommodation is not a crime.
It starts out so well-intentioned.
It's so well-intentioned. It's a parent bending over backward, doing everything they can, pouring time, energy, sometimes money into trying to help their anxious child not feel anxious. But I think one really important thing for parents to know is that there's a lot of research on this, and all of it, literally without exception, shows the same direction, which is that as accommodation gets more and more, children's anxiety gets worse rather than better. This is a really important thing to know because it's so bewildering. Like you feel like, well, maybe I have to accommodate even more. They're even more anxious. Maybe I should do even more accommodation. And so you get trapped into this cycle. One of the things that we try to do in space, right, in the treatment that we do with parents, is to actually give them tools to start dialing that back in the other direction. In a gradual way, not all at once, not overnight, but gradually you start to make a change so that you can be reducing rather than increasing that accommodation. And it's so important because when you do that, what you're also doing is communicating to your child, the anxious child, you're communicating the message, actually, I think you can be okay. I think you're not so sick, so helpless, so vulnerable that I need to arrange the whole world just around your anxiety. Actually, I think you will be okay, even if you get anxious, which is a really important message for an anxious child to hear.
I'd love to hear an example in that case, what the parent could do in that situation. Because I know I've heard you talk about how analogy is if your child has muscle weakness, right? And you want them to go to PT, you don't say, oh, you know what, you have muscle weakness, I'm going to just carry you around the rest of your life. You send them to PT and they have to strengthen those muscles, right? So what should the parents do or could they do in this situation?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good example. That's a good analogy. Like the muscles, if your child does have weak muscle, like no doctor is going to say, okay, always carry them, right? Like that's never going to be the recommendation. It's always about strengthening that muscle. Why? Because they can, right? Like that's the critical thing. If your child has, a form of paralysis, then you do carry them around or, use some kind of like aid in order to help them get around because it's just cruel to expect them to do something they can't do, right? It's like the difference between teaching your child to ride a bike when they're 5 and when they're 5 months. If you are teaching your child to ride a bike and they're 5 months old, you're just a jerk, right? They're going to fall and there's no value to it because they can't really learn that. And I'm sure somewhere there's a YouTube out there of like a 5-month-old riding a bike, but someone's gonna send in the YouTube. But at 5 months, they also might fall. At 5 years, they also might fall, but there's value to it because they can achieve it. Now, going back to the accommodation or the anxiety, what does that look like? Now, a really important thing to know is that in space, we're not saying you have to make your child strengthen their muscles. It sounds like that's what I'm about to say, but actually it isn't. We're not saying go home and tell your child they have to do this thing that they're scared of, or they have to stop doing this other thing. Giving that kind of advice to parents, go home and tell your child to do X or not to do Y, is actually a recipe for disaster. Because what we really know is that although that might sound really good in theory, what every parent actually knows is that getting your kids to do things they don't want to do is really hard. And when you, as a therapist, if you say to the parent, go home and make your kid do something, you may be setting them up for a lot of conflict, for fighting, for resistance. You may make things worse rather than better. So what do we do in space? We just focus on changing what the parent themselves are doing, what the parent is doing. We never say, make your child do anything. I literally make it as a promise to parents. Like first session, I'll say to them, here's a commitment. At no point in this treatment will I ask you to make your kid do anything at all. And they're surprised because they kind of assume that's what it's going to be about, but it isn't. It's about what you're going to do. So what might that look like? You have that kid with social anxiety. Maybe you start thinking about all the ways you have been accommodating, like the fact that every time someone speaks to them, it's always you answer it. Because your kid has social anxiety. They're not going to answer. So you jump in because it's awkward. And when the waiter walks over and asks, what do they want to have? You answer. When they want to get the book from the librarian, you speak for them. When like all of those situations, maybe you decide, okay, I won't be doing maybe start with one of those things. I won't be doing that one thing anymore. And you're going to let your child know about that change. You're not going to surprise them. You're not going to get mad at them if they don't speak. But you're going to make that change on yourself. Maybe you say, I am going to let my other child have a play date in the house. I'm going to have a conversation and say, you know what? Yeah, we get it. It's true. It will be hard for everybody because it will cause anxiety, but we don't think we're helping by arranging life like this. We don't actually think that's the best thing for anybody in the family. And so from now on, yeah, actually, you're going to be able to have a play date in our house, and we will be there to ensure that it is not turned into a nightmare by your anxious kid who's going to be so upset and so worried or scared or whatever, things like that. So you have to kind of, stand by it. You have to have a really good plan. When we tell parents to start reducing accommodations, we always think really carefully about how they're going to cope with all the different responses to that, that the anxious child might have. Maybe they'll get upset or angry.
Right. It's not always smooth sailing right off the bat.
Yeah, it's not always smooth sailing right away. But when you stick to it, when you're thoughtful about your plan in advance and you stick to it in a calm, loving, supportive way, you get past those, very quickly. It changes from anger to relief because I'm seeing, to hope, because I'm seeing I actually can cope with this. Maybe I didn't want to see that. Maybe I didn't believe it. But you know what? The sun still rose today, even though you didn't accommodate me yesterday, right? And I'm still here.
They can handle it. It's uncomfortable, I always say, but not dangerous.
Exactly.
Dr. Eli, let me ask you a question. In our practice, we see a lot of younger kids. And so separation anxiety at bedtime in particular is a common presenting problem where parents say, they want me to snuggle with them until they fall asleep. Can you take us through kind of typical bedtime struggles that parents and children with anxiety have and kind of how you coach the parents?
Sure. And of course, this is such a common difficulty, such a common challenge, right? Nighttime is when our fears come up. It's the longest separation that we have. It's kind of a scary time. A lot of fears will come up in that moment. And, the tricky thing about separation anxiety is that any anxiety can be separation anxiety. Why? Because whatever it is that you're scared or worried about, being with your parent might make you feel better when you're a child. So maybe you're not worried about separation. Maybe you're worried about the test in school tomorrow. So you have a generalized anxiety symptom. But guess what? Being with your parent might help you to feel better. So it turns into a separation anxiety symptom, just again, because of how we are built as the species that we are. Now, I do want to say it is important to distinguish between a child who actually has like a problem and a child who occasionally feels anxious and wants to snuggle with a parent. I don't think we have to, the first time your kid comes into the room and says, there's a monster under my bed, you don't have to give them Prozac and, send them to the clinic and the hospital. Like those are normal things. We expect kids to be worried sometimes. But, when it is more of an ongoing challenge, then just like with the other accommodations, it's worth it to be able to show the child that they're able to cope with some of this on their own. Now, there's a lot of different ways to try to make a change there. I will tell you my favorite way to try to make a change around bedtime. And I love this because you can do it as a game. You can do it in a playful way rather than in a more kind of like, oh, I'm laying down the law kind of way. And so what I'll often do is say, let's play a game. And the game is we're going to put on a show, right? Like theater. We're going to put on a show and there's an imaginary audience. And we're going to fool this imaginary audience into thinking that you, the child, that you're going to go to sleep alone by yourself in your bed. But you're not. You're not. And in fact, they're not, right? We're not lying to them. It's all true. Don't worry. It's just a show. So how would we do that? Well, we'll make sure you actually have a bed. Like maybe we need to clear off all the things because you've been sleeping in mom's bed for months or like let's put some fresh linen, maybe buy a new set, like let's make it nice and fun. And you're going to get ready for bed, brush your teeth, put on your pajamas. You're going to get into your bed. Mom or dad, they're going to come in. They're going to kiss you goodnight. They're going to leave. So the audience watching thinks, here's a kid going to sleep by themselves. Except you won't, because 2 minutes later, mom or dad, they're going to come back into the room. They're going to say, game over. And they're going to lie down next to you just like they do every other night. Or you're going to go to their bed just like you do every other night. And you're going to go to sleep. And because you present it like that, kids are very often willing to go along with this because you're not asking much.
Right. You're asking 2 minutes for them to go along.
2 minutes, and then they get to be successful and they get to be with the parent after success rather than after failure, right? It's like, this is great. And then you do that for a few nights. And the only thing that happens is we will inch up on the amount of time that the parent leaves. So we'll do a few nights at 2 minutes and then 5 minutes and then 7 minutes, 10 minutes. But here's the thing, when you get up to about 10, 15 minutes, guess what happens? It falls asleep during that time because they're tired, it's nighttime, and critically, they're not anxious. Why are they not anxious? Because they know the parent's coming back. And so they're not sitting there worried. If you said you have to go to sleep by yourself, they would be up for hours, yelling, crying, calling, thinking, churning away in their mind. They'd be up for hours. But they know they don't. They know the parent's coming right back. And so they're calm. Well, you take a calm, tired kid, put them in a comfortable bed, they're going to fall asleep, and then you just let them sleep. And you keep going with that. The next day you say, hey, that was really cool that you slept in your bed. But you don't say, from now on, you're going to do it by yourself every night.
It's baby steps.
Yeah, exactly. And you just keep going like that. We have had so much success with getting kids to sleep in their own bed using this approach that I really, if you're listening and you're a parent of a kid who's like, why won't they sleep in their own bed? Give it a try.
Dr. Ali, there was another example you've talked about in this regard, an extreme example where the child just wanted someone to say, I love you. Can you talk about that for a minute and
Absolutely.
how that manifested?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a really good example of how much an accommodation can really take over life because, it sounds really small. Like what kid doesn't want their parent to say, I love you? But this was an 8-year-old boy and he was really scared of spiders. Particularly, he was really scared of the black widow spider. He thought it would come into his bed. And
me too, by the way.
Well,
me too. I totally relate to this.
Yeah, well, I mean, who does want a black widow spider in bed at night, right? Like not many of us do. But here's the thing. I mean, he would do a lot of things to try to prevent it. He would like close the windows, keep a light on, search the room for spiders, which if you really do have the same level of fear as he did, you might find yourself doing as well, Jeremy. But he was 8 years old. And so he also had another thought. And this was the idea that for him to be safe, the very last thing that had to like go through his mind before he fell asleep had to be his father saying to him, "Good night, son, and I love you very much." If that was the last thing, he would be safe, which rationally doesn't actually make a lot of sense. No, all of our research indicates spiders do not care if your father loves you very much or not. Spiders, by the way, not really known for their paternal caregiving behavior of all the species in the world, but it does make sense emotionally because when you're a child and your father says, "I love you," that is that attachment system. That is an attachment signal, and it makes you feel safer. And so when he was going to sleep, he called his dad into the room and he said, "Dad, can you say good night, son, and I love you very much?" And his dad felt pretty good at first. And he said, "Of course, good night, son, I love you very much." And he walked out of the room. But guess what? It takes time to fall asleep. Soon another thought crawls into the kid's mind. Now it's ruined. He calls the dad back into the room. He says, "Can you say it again?" Okay, says it again, walks out, calls him back, says it again, walks out. When I met this family, I asked this man, the father of this 8-year-old boy, "How many times are you actually saying good night, son, and I love you very much before your kid is finally asleep?" And he counted for 7 nights until our next appointment. He counted every night. And he was averaging about 120 times every single night.
Wow.
That is like 3 hours of sex easily. And that's not, if you do it nonstop, it's 3 hours. If you take a break, it's more than that. And it really shows you how much this can take over because everybody's affected by that. Everyone, right?
Right. No one's sleeping in the household.
No one's sleeping. No one, again, you have siblings. What if that kid has a sister who needs help with her homework? Well, dad can't do that because he's running in and out of his other kid's room to say good night, son, and I love you very much. And, mom and dad can't be spending some time together, maintaining their relationship. Dad can't be doing, I don't know, like catching up on work. I mean, and the kid himself, he's up until the middle of the night, right? Like he's not getting, those are 4 hours sleep.
And the parents' sweetness and saying, "I love you, good night," changes very rapidly after 3 hours. So I love you, good night.
Really, when you're at 120 times, I guarantee it does not sound like good night, son, and I love you very much.
No, we've all been there.
Really, I mean, it's like, you wish you had a spider to throw in this kid's face at this point. It's like, of course, and like I say jokingly, but actually this intense level of accommodation, it really does build up some resentment. Like you do it because you feel like you have to do it, but it can build up some resentment because this is impacting your life on a really deep level. You are so frustrated by it, and it places real strain on the parent-child relationship. When you feel like your kid is constantly taking from you, it's hard to have the pleasure of giving. Right? It's hard to have, that's a principle that holds true even with other things, right? Like, you have a kid, they always want you to buy something, right? And it's like, you're always like, you feel like they're always like taking from you. You lose some of the pleasure that comes from like the fun of actually giving. And by the way, happens for the child too. When you are always in the position of demanding, you also miss out on the pleasure of receiving because it doesn't feel like receiving. It feels like taking from someone. The accommodation can work in the same way and place a real strain on that parent-child relationship. We looked at parent-child relationship before and after space treatment and found really significant improvements in the quality of the relationship between the parent and the child. And that's even though the parent is doing things along the way that the child might not like. But actually, you get to the end of treatment and they have a better, stronger, and warmer relationship than at the beginning.
Right. It's like it gets worse before it gets better. You have to be prepared for that journey.
Exactly.
So what did that parent end up doing? How did they pare it down from 120 and 4 hours a night?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you want to break things off a little bit at a time. So maybe you say like, okay, I will say goodnight, but I will say it X number of times. Like I'm not going to go from 120 to 110 because like I think that's going to not be noticeable enough. But a parent like that might say, and very genuinely, like they'll say to the child, like, "I know how scared you are." Right? We're not dismissing that.
Right.
we're really validating it. It really is very scary for you. Also, I know you can handle being scared sometimes. And I don't think I'm helping by doing this. And so starting tonight, I will say goodnight 2 times, and then I won't. Now, you go into that, you have to put on your flak jacket a little bit, right? Like your helmet, and you have to be ready for maybe a really long night, right? Like that first night that you do that, maybe your child will not sit up and say, thank you so much for understanding how to treat child anxiety in this method, right? Like they may be really, really upset. They may not get much sleep, maybe start it on a weekend when if they don't get much sleep, it's not the end of the world. But a few nights later,
they'll be worried if the other kids in the family don't get sleep. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's part of it. You just have to be prepared for that.
Exactly. Maybe have have your sister come over and help with like the other kids because you're going to be dealing with this for a night or two, right? Like get some help in doing it. But a few nights later, when your kid is actually falling asleep in half an hour instead of 3 hours, and you've had that time, you're going to feel really different.
OCD is a common problem that you see, and especially with the space treatment. There was a case, an example with OCD that involved a sister.
Yeah,
so you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean OCD is it's actually interesting. OCD is the first disorder in which family accommodation was ever identified and studied. And when I was doing a postdoc at the Child Study Center at Yale, where I'm still work today, I was learning about this like research on OCD and family accommodation, and I was seeing all these accommodations in other anxiety problems. And so I went to do like a review of like, what is the literature, what does the research say on accommodation in other anxiety problems? It ended up being a very short literature review because there were exactly 0 studies of accommodation outside of OCD. So we did that study and many more since then, and now we know a lot about it. But accommodation is really so prevalent in all the anxiety and definitely in OCD as well. In the case that you mentioned, it's such an interesting story because, and actually kind of again involves both parents and siblings. So we had a child who was she was 13, and she had a form of OCD that's going to sound a little weird to people who are not so well versed in OCD, but actually is not so rare. Because maybe you've heard about contamination fears in OCD, and you think about germs, bacteria, things like that. But another kind of contamination is contamination from human beings of the essence of the person, as though you can become more like that person through contact with them, which sounds a little cuckoo when you first hear it, but actually is not so rare and is not psychotic. It's just an OCD thought. So for example, you might, think, oh, if I see someone who is bad, I will become bad, right? Like I'll see a picture of a criminal and I will become a criminal, or things like that. I had a kid who was afraid to go to sports games because he thought he would become a fan of the wrong team just by like coming into contact with the enemy. But this kid she was 13 years old, and she was what back in the day they used to call a tomboy, meaning she was not stereotypically feminine, and she actually had a great aversion for anything that was too pink and frill and Barbie and like too girly in perhaps dated terms, but too girly in her mind. And so she avoided anything like that. Now, she had a younger sister, and her younger sister, who was only 6 years old, was of course the opposite, and was the most girly girl that you could imagine. Everything was pink and everything was frills. And her older sister was just terrified of this. Now, what did this lead to? She did everything she could to avoid any kind of contact. When the mother did laundry, she not only would not wash their clothes together, but would actually run an empty load of the washing machine, just empty with no clothes, between
Oh my goodness.
putting the siblings' clothes in the wash and putting hers. Or at the very least, she promised that she did do that. She mostly did. Some misses, but she really did do that. And they would not go in the car together at the same time. And so
It's
parents would,
heartbreaking.
yeah, they would like carpool, but like it's the opposite of carpool, right? It's like whatever the opposite of carpool is, that's what they did. Like separate vehicles to drive the two, even if they're going to literally the same place. And so many other forms. Now, actually, all of that was not enough to bring them into treatment. What actually brought them into treatment was when this 13-year-old came up with a new rule. And the rule was that the younger sister, who, by the way, wanted nothing more than for her older sister to smile at her, to play with her. She looked up to her. She adored her. But the 13-year-old came up with this rule that said that the younger sister is not allowed to cross her field of vision. Now, what does that mean? That means that if this 6-year-old wants to get a cup of milk, she needs to chart a course through the house that will guarantee that her older sister will not see her, which frankly starts becoming abusive toward a 6-year-old child who is not just allowed to freely move around in the household. And at that point, the parents said, we think we need some help.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how it gets to that point right before parents are aware, because again, most parents, well-intentioned parents just will do anything to avoid these outbursts, these tantrums, this pain.
Yes.
And it only becomes obvious when it's so far.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I go back to something that you said before, Lee, about we're not blaming the parents for these problems.
Right.
I say we, I mean mental health, like writ large, right? Like we represent a field that has done a lot of damage over many years by espousing theories that blame parents for child psychopathology. Parents have been blamed repeatedly, blamed for schizophrenia. It's not true. There is not a schizophrenogenic mother that causes schizophrenia in her children. This was an influential theory. Parents were blamed for autism, eating disorders, like everything. And time and again, empirical evidence fails to support those hypotheses. I don't believe that parents cause anxiety disorders in their children in the vast majority of cases. If you are a truly committed, motivated person, you can do a lot of damage through things like maltreatment, abuse, and neglect. But that is not at all the story for the huge majority of kids with anxiety. And so parents are trying their best. And there are so many other contexts in which accommodation is the right answer. If your child has food allergies, you should accommodate that, right? Like, what should you do? Should you say, well, we don't believe in accommodation, and so we're going to prepare food as though you don't have food allergies, and then what? You're going to die? Like, that is awful advice, right? If you have diabetes, if you have asthma, if you have like a lot of conditions, accommodation is necessary. In anxiety, it's natural for parents to apply a similar model, right? Like, this makes you anxious. Why would I not avoid it? That makes sense. And by the way, it's also a message, unfortunately, that is also delivered by poorly informed mental health providers. I spoke to, we've been giving a lot of examples. Let me give one more. Also in an OCD example, but this was, actually, I kind of touched on something really related a moment ago, because this was a kid who was really terrified of seeing or coming into contact with people with a physical disability. For example, when mom would drive him somewhere, she would not drive on the road where the YMCA was, because he knew that there were people with disabilities who went to work out there. And this bothered him. Now, one day, his grandma took him to the mall, and she didn't know all the rules. And she parked the car in the parking spot next to the spot for a person with a wheelchair. Now, There wasn't even a person with the wheelchair. There wasn't even a car there, but the wheelchair is painted on the ground, right, in the parking spot. That was enough. He would not get in the car anymore. They bought a different car.
Wow.
Literally, they bought a different car. Now, granted, this was a family that could afford to do that, but they did. And when I asked this parent, seriously, right, like, wow, why? She said to me, because the psychiatrist told me don't trigger him, which sounds like good advice, right? Like, why would you trigger? Like, nobody wants to be triggered. Like, our whole, everybody's talking about like not triggering people. Why would you want to trigger him? It sounds like good advice, and yet it actually is very poor advice, because what it translates into for a parent is always accommodate.
Exactly.
So what do the parents do? It seems like it's so far gone that they're buying a new car. How do you back away from that, right? What did they actually do?
Yeah. Well, they took one step at a time, which is what we generally do. The way we'll work through this treatment is the first thing that we're going to do, even before we start making these behavioral changes, we work on what we call being supportive, starting to communicate to a child those messages of acceptance, but also of confidence. The idea that I do get that it's hard, and also I believe you can handle it. We start trickling those messages into the discourse, into how I'm responding. And we do that for a couple of weeks. Now, the next step that we'll do is to map out what are all the different ways that we're accommodating. And, there'll often be a lot. And then we'll pick one thing. Maybe it's the driving on the other street, or, like any one of the things that are happening. I like to choose something that is happening pretty frequently, so that we have a lot of opportunity to practice, and we will let the child know this is our plan. We'll write a letter. Actually, what we'll do with parents, kind of write a letter to the child where we'll just lay out, here's what we're doing, and here's why we are doing it. And then we'll follow through on that. Plan for that child with the wheelchair and the car. The first step that the parent actually took was not censoring, which something she would do very carefully, the materials that were in the home, like newspaper, books, television. She would scan and like censor to make sure that there wouldn't be something that the child saw that would trigger the OCD. And that was like one first step for them to take. And again, it goes back to the message that I was saying before. When you're doing that censoring, like, you think, okay, I'm being helpful, but it's so clearly sending a message to the child that says, I know you can't cope with this. By not,
and they don't have any practice at all.
Exactly.
Coping with uncomfortable feelings this way,
Exactly.
with walking on eggshells.
Exactly. So that was her first step. Now, again, it's very different from saying you need to, right? Like, she never said to the child, you need to buck up and stop avoiding, or go shake hands with the person in the wheelchair. Like, she never said anything like that. She just said, this is what I'm doing because this is what I believe. And that kid got so much better. Actually, she was years in touch with me and would send me the photos and updates, because she could not believe that her child was living a life that was not as limited and impaired in the way that it was prior to her treatment.
It's so neat to hear these anecdotes. I'm just going to ask one final question, Dr. Eli. How do you handle it when one parent is not entirely on board with this plan of reducing the accommodations, and the other parent is really motivated? And this could be, a divorce situation, or it could just be a married couple where one is ready to make changes and one is not.
Sure. Yeah. And of course that does happen, whether, right, like you said, whether married or divorced. There are divorced parents that really work amazingly well together. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are also married parents that are not working amazingly well together. Put it, that way. The first thing that I will typically do is try to understand what the objection of the other parent is. Like, are they willing to have maybe just one conversation with me with no strings attached? I just want to understand. Maybe like is it that they don't like me? Is it that they don't like this treatment? They don't think there's a problem. They don't believe in therapy. Like, what are the issues? And try to understand it. But bottom line, if they are really not willing to participate, I will work with that other parent. And I will, the one that does want to work with me, and I will encourage them to also just focus on themselves, not to go home and say to that other parent, you should also do this, because they've told you they're not motivated. That is just going to antagonize them. But treatment can still be effective, even when one parent is doing it, and even if the other parent continues to like very explicitly not follow the plan. They continue to accommodate. There's still tremendous value in having even one of your parents showing you that they believe you can handle your anxiety. That makes a huge difference. The other thing that I'll do is I will keep open communication to that other parent. I'll usually send them a brief email at the end of every session and just say, hey, here's what we talked about. I'm not saying I want you to do it too. I'm just saying, here's what we talked about, because I want to be respectful. I want to show them that I'm not mad, that there's an open door for them to come back. And I also want them not to be speculating on what is happening in those sessions. For example, maybe they'll sit there thinking, oh, they're just talking about me the whole time and why I'm a lousy husband, partner, ex. And sometimes that is what the parent who comes wants to do. It's not unheard of, but that's not what we do. And I want them to know that. And so I'll send them like, here's a little summary. We've had a lot of parents who change their mind.
Right, especially if they see some improvement in the child.
Exactly. There's a case of a kid with social anxiety, about like 13 years old. This dad, it didn't make sense to him. The ideas didn't make sense to him. Like didn't add up. Like, why do you want to work with parents and like the whole therapy thing? And so he was like, you know what, I don't really think so. But a few weeks later, I'm going to give this a try. He ended up being the rock star of that whole treatment. He carried the treatment, like such an really amazing dad who found like his words to communicate to his child the messages that we're trying to communicate. And so, the door is open. Sometimes like they'll change their mind, but even if they don't, you can still make a meaningful and impactful change, and you don't have to fight with your partner or ex about it.
That's empowering and encouraging.
Yeah.
First of all, Dr. Eli, I want to be the first one to thank you. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. And, this is really, for me, I take out of it, it's just a life lesson in general. We can only control ourselves in this equation, regardless of anything that's going on. And so that to me is really a resounding message of what you talk about in breaking free of child anxiety and OCD, and just the space treatment, which is we can control ourselves. And like you said, even when you gave the same answer, it's like, hey, what if another parent's not on board? Well, it goes back to we can only control ourselves and help through ourselves. And I just want to thank you. I'm just going to share, if anyone wants to learn more, which they should, there's spacetreatment.net. You can see, if you're listening to the audio, there's a video piece, and we're looking at the website. There's lots of resources here. We're looking at the book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. There's another one for parents and clinicians. There's one for clinicians. There's videos. I know Lee and I have watched a lot of these and read a lot of these. And there's even research articles, which, we didn't have a chance to talk about all these things, but I was fascinated by, there's a pilot trial of space in autism. And there's so much other research that you're doing here. So you can actually poke around on the website and check these out. And in addition, there's training for therapists here as well. I encourage everyone to check out spacetreatment.net and all the resources there. Dr. Eli, just thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very, very much. It's really been a pleasure and an honor. You really put your finger, you hit the nail on the head with you can only control yourself. That is the underlying, I think, principle that guides so much of the way this treatment works. So thank you really very much for the opportunity to be on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.